It started with a casual gym invite and ended with the kind of silence that says everything words can't. I wasn't looking for anything that day. Not a spark, not a shift, not him. But one moment in the heat changed everything. And what followed, I'll never forget. There was something about that day that made everything feel slightly out of sync. The humidity, the thick clouds hanging low without offering relief, and the odd way time seemed to move slower than usual. After a long and intense workout at the local fitness center in Hartwick, I was wiping sweat from my forehead when he casually tossed me a towel. "You up for the sauna?" he asked, his tone offhand, almost lazy, but something in the way he looked at me made my chest tighten. That look, calm, steady, and maybe just a little too aware, lingered longer than necessary. I nodded, trying not to let anything show on my face, as if the heat from the gym wasn't already enough to make my thoughts blur. We didn't usually hang out alone, at least not like this. Most of our time together was in groups or quick post-workout chats near the lockers. But now, it was just us, heading down a quiet hallway, the sound of our sneakers echoing faintly against the tiled floor. The door to the sauna creaked open, and a wave of heat rushed out, wrapping around us like a blanket. I paused, instinctively holding my breath, but his glance back at me was easygoing, just a small flick of the brow, a silent "you coming" that I couldn't resist. I stepped in behind him. Inside, the scent of cedarwood and steam filled my lungs. The space was compact, the kind that magnified presence, that made every motion feel significant. He settled on the upper bench with a relaxed sigh, stretching his legs out in front of him, and I chose the lower one, the heat already making my skin prickle. For a while, the only sound was the soft hiss from the rocks and the slow rhythm of our breathing. My heart thudded a little too loud, the pulse in my neck a little too sharp. I stared at a knot in the wooden paneling, tried to ignore the awareness buzzing under my skin, the sense that I wasn't just reacting to the heat. Eventually, he spoke, voice softened by the weight of the steam. "Rough day." I gave a quiet nod, not trusting myself to say more. It wasn't just the day, though. It was everything. A buildup of something I never quite put into words, something that always stayed at the edge of my thoughts whenever he was around. A flicker of curiosity, a quiet pull. He leaned back, closing his eyes, the muscles in his shoulders relaxing. I watched him for a moment before forcing myself to look away. The heat was doing strange things to my head, making everything slow and dreamlike, like we were suspended in time, far from the rest of the world. Without warning, I felt something nudge my foot, a light, playful tap. I looked up, startled, and he was watching me now, that familiar smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Bet you can't handle the heat up here," he said, motioning to the upper bench. It was teasing, but also a challenge, and something about it sparked that same restless energy in me that had been simmering all afternoon. With a roll of my eyes and a feigned sigh, I climbed up to join him. The temperature difference was immediate. The higher bench wrapped me in a new intensity, but I stayed still, willing myself to act unfazed. "Not bad," he said under his breath, eyes half-lidded. Then he shifted, just enough that our arms brushed. His skin against mine felt hotter than the air, and it sent a strange jolt down my spine. I stayed still, pretending not to notice, but every point of contact felt amplified, every inch of space between us suddenly charged. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I, but he didn't move away. Instead, he stayed just like that, close but not touching again, silent but present. The room felt heavier, not just from the heat, but from something else entirely. Tension wrapped around us like the steam, thick and persistent. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe evenly, but the way his leg rested lightly against mine made it impossible to ignore him. Then he leaned back slightly, exhaling a breath that sounded far more intentional than relaxed. I glanced over. His eyes were closed, but his posture betrayed awareness, like he wasn't just relaxing but waiting. I tried to push the thoughts away, grounding myself in the present. The warm wood under my palms, the rhythmic hiss from the stones, the faint creak of the sauna door expanding from the heat. But my body betrayed me. My heartbeat refused to calm, and my skin felt too alive, too alert to every shift beside me. This wasn't new, not entirely. There had always been something, glances that lasted a beat too long, jokes that danced on the edge of something deeper. But today, in this closed space with the world shut out, it was no longer abstract. It was tangible. Eventually, he moved, just a slight shift, his arm brushing mine again. And then he stood, stretching his back to me. "We should probably get going," he said, voice light, almost casual. I nodded and followed, the rush of cooler air outside the sauna slapping me back into reality. Neither of us said much as we got dressed. The silence was no longer comfortable, but it wasn't awkward either. It was full. And as we left the gym, side by side in the soft dusk of early evening, he glanced at me once, a quiet smile ghosting across his lips. "Same time next week?" I hesitated only for breath. "Yeah," I said, voice low but sure. And somehow, that single word felt like a promise, or at least the beginning of one. The week passed in a strange blur, filled with ordinary tasks that felt anything but. Each moment, no matter how trivial, seemed colored by the memory of the sauna, of the stillness, the charged silence, of Nolan. I found myself standing outside the entrance to the Havenwell Athletic Center earlier than usual, checking my phone, though I knew he wasn't late. The buzz inside the gym felt unusually loud, every clang of weights and hum of treadmills amplified by the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I leaned against the wall, trying to appear casual, but my thoughts kept circling back to the way Head looked at me. Steady, unreadable, almost daring. When he finally arrived, he gave a small nod and a faint smile. There was nothing dramatic in his greeting, just a quiet familiarity that somehow made everything inside me tighten. We exchanged a few words, the usual pleasantries, then headed into our workout routine, letting muscle memory take over. But underneath the surface, there was a shift. Each rep, each rest between sets, felt threaded with something unspoken, a growing awareness neither of us dared acknowledge. The conversation was light, cautious. Our laughter came easier than expected, but our eyes rarely lingered. The moments between words held more weight than the words themselves. Afterwards, as we grabbed towels and wiped down our gear, he gave me a sidelong glance, his grin slightly lopsided. No question needed to be spoken. The answer was already in motion. We made our way down the familiar hallway, side by side again. The sound of our steps echoed, softer this time, more measured. When the sauna door opened, the heat welcomed us like a returning pulse. Inside, I took my usual place on the lower bench, and he climbed to the upper one, mirroring the way we'd sat before, as if recreating the moment might bring clarity. The air was thick, wrapping around us with the same heavy quiet. We didn't speak at first. Minutes passed, our breathing sinking slowly with the rhythmic hiss of steam. I focused on the wood grain beside me, letting my vision blur. But the stillness between us spoke volumes. Every flicker of movement, every slight shift in posture, felt like a sentence left unfinished. Then, breaking the silence, Nolan leaned forward. His voice was careful, almost tentative, the kind you use when you're stepping on unfamiliar ground. He asked if things had been strange last time. His tone wasn't accusatory, more like a confession disguised as a question. I glanced up, surprised. He wasn't looking at me directly. His gaze was fixed on a point across the room, as if he couldn't bear to meet mine. I replied that maybe it had been a little unexpected. That was the truth, or part of it. The rest stayed lodged in my chest, too tangled to name. He nodded, still not meeting my eyes. His fingers tapped lightly against his knee, a subtle rhythm that betrayed a nervousness he wouldn't admit out loud. Then came a sentence I didn't expect, soft, almost inaudible. Maybe I crossed a line. The words hung there, suspended in the steam. My chest tightened. I wanted to respond, to reach out and strip away the uncertainty. But instead, I offered a half smile and a quiet reassurance. "It's fine," I said, though my thoughts shouted otherwise. He leaned back again, letting the silence reclaim the space between us. The steam curled lazily around our bodies, blurring edges, softening lines. My skin prickled from the heat, but the tension wasn't from the temperature. After a while, he spoke again, barely above a whisper. He didn't want things to be tense. I nodded, grateful for the honesty, but also painfully aware that the tension wasn't something we could will away. It had taken root somewhere deep, too intertwined with everything we hadn't said. Still, that moment felt like a truce, temporary but real. A breath of air in the stifling room. But as the minutes slipped by, that fragile peace began to fray. I could feel his eyes on me occasionally, the weight of his gaze just grazing my skin before slipping away. And every time our eyes did meet, even just for a second, something tightened in my chest, a familiar flutter that made breathing harder. Eventually, we stood and exited. The rush of cool air from the corridor was jarring, snapping us back into reality. We dressed in silence, motions practiced and automatic, but the air between us was thick, clinging to us even outside the sauna. Just as we reached the main doors, Nolan paused. His expression unreadable, his voice light, too light. He suggested a drink. Casual, offhand. But beneath that casualness, something flickered. A hesitation. A hope. I agreed without really thinking. The words left my mouth before my brain could process them. We ended up in a small, dimly lit bar, just a few blocks away. A quiet place tucked away from the Friday night noise. The lighting was soft, and the air smelled faintly of citrus and old wood. We settled into a booth in the corner, our drinks arriving quickly. The clink of glass sounded loud in the otherwise hushed space. At first, the conversation was surface level. Safe. We talked about music, old stories from college, made fun of our worst gym injuries. But underneath the laughter was a shared tension that neither of us could mask. It pulsed through every pause, every glance. With time, and maybe with the help of the second round, our words started to loosen. The silences between us felt less heavy. We joked more freely, our eyes meeting longer, lingering a little too long to be just friendly. But still, neither of us said the thing we were both circling around. It was there between us waiting, a silent question hanging in the air. What are we doing? As the night wore on, and the bar began to empty out, that question only grew louder in my mind. And yet, neither of us answered it. Not yet. The night air outside the bar was cool, almost sharp, a striking contrast to the warmth inside. As we stepped out, the streets of Dalemont were quiet, the dim orange of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. We walked side by side in silence, our footsteps echoing off brick walls and empty storefronts. And though no one spoke, the air between us was alive. There was a current, slow but steady, pulling us closer, a quiet gravity that had been building for weeks. Every shared glance, every brush of his arm against mine as we walked, seemed to hum with something unspoken. We eventually turned onto a quiet path that led into the city's Central Park, a place we had both passed 100 times but never visited together. Trees stood tall around us, their leaves rustling softly in the night breeze. The pond ahead shimmered, catching bits of starlight between gentle ripples. Everything felt distant, muted, like we had stepped into a moment outside of time. Nolan paused near a weathered bench by the water, then sat. I followed without hesitation, lowering myself beside him. Neither of us said a word. The silence was thick, but it wasn't awkward. It was full. Every breath, every small movement carried weight. I could feel his presence beside me, grounding and disorienting all at once. Every few seconds, our arms would brush, and every time they did, a quiet tremor rippled through me. He turned his head slightly, eyes on the dark water. "I've been thinking," he said at last, his voice barely above a murmur, "about this." The words didn't surprise me. I felt them building in the way he looked at me, in the way he hesitated before speaking. I didn't respond. Not yet. I wasn't sure I trusted my voice. I didn't expect it to feel like this, he continued. I didn't think. He trailed off. His hands were clasped between his knees, knuckles tight. I wanted to reach out, to touch his shoulder, to lace my fingers with his, but I stayed still. My heart was thudding too loudly, my breath catching in my throat. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, eyes searching. There was fear there, but also hope. I saw it, flickering beneath the surface. Before I could think too much, I reached across the small space and rested my hand over his. The contact was soft, barely more than a touch. But it was enough. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. For a moment, neither of us breathed. It felt like the entire park had gone still, holding its breath along with us. His fingers, tense beneath mine, slowly relaxed. Then he turned his palm upward, allowing my hand to settle more fully into his. We stayed like that for what felt like a lifetime. The first movement was subtle, his thumb grazing my skin. Then his other hand joined, cradling mine between both of his. He looked at me again, and this time he didn't look away. The question that had hung between us for so long was finally spoken, not with words, but with touch. When he leaned in, I didn't hesitate. Our foreheads met first, a soft press, tentative and still. I could feel his breath against my lips, warm and steady, and I knew he was waiting. For permission, for certainty. I gave it the only way I knew how, by closing the distance. The kiss was gentle at first, careful, our lips brushing like a question waiting for its answer. But the moment we touched, the tension that had wrapped around us for weeks shattered into something warm, trembling, and real. Time blurred. My senses narrowed to the feel of his hand at the side of my face, the press of his lips, the soft, unsure rhythm that grew more confident with each passing second. The world around us melted away. No more city noise, no more doubt, just us and the sound of our joined breath. It wasn't a kiss full of certainty. It was cautious, nervous, maybe even afraid. But it was also honest, and it was enough. When we finally pulled apart, the space between us felt different. Calmer, quieter. He didn't speak, and neither did I. There was nothing more to say. Eventually, he gave a small smile, tired but real, and reached for my hand again, intertwining our fingers. We sat that way for a while. No rush, no expectations, just presence. And for the first time in a long while, I felt peace. As we walked back toward my place, the silence between us was no longer something to break. It was something to share. We didn't need to fill it. Everything important had already been said. When we reached my door, he stopped, his fingers still wrapped gently around mine. His eyes met mine, softer now. "You okay with this?" There was no hesitation in me anymore. "Yeah," I whispered. "I'm sure." He nodded slowly, as if sealing something invisible between us. Then, forehead to forehead, once again, we stood there in the quiet, not quite ready to say goodbye, not quite needing to say anything else. And when he finally let go and walked away, I knew something had changed. Not just between us, within me. The days after that night slipped by in an odd rhythm. Everything looked the same, familiar workouts, the same locker room, the same nods across the gym floor, but nothing felt the same. Beneath the surface, something had shifted. The ease between us had been replaced by something denser. Not silence, exactly. More like a hesitation wrapped in habit. Every interaction had a subtle edge. The once comfortable banter now felt cautious, like we were both walking across ice unsure of its thickness. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it, but I knew better. That spark we had finally acknowledged hadn't disappeared. It had dimmed, hidden beneath layers neither of us was brave enough to peel back. He still showed up. We still moved through our routines. We still sat in silence when we cooled down after training. But there were fewer glances, fewer accidental touches, fewer reasons to linger. One evening, a message arrived from him. Just a casual invitation to grab coffee. I agreed without thinking, though something in the tone unsettled me. It sounded neutral, too neutral. When I arrived, he was already at the table, eyes fixed on his phone. His smile, when he looked up, was faint, more out of politeness than ease. There was a pause before he spoke, a pause that said more than anything he could have said out loud. Small talk followed. Shallow, controlled. He was present, but only partially, like a part of him had already drifted somewhere else. I waited for him to name what we were both feeling, but he didn't. Eventually, I broke the tension with a simple question, not because I wanted confrontation, but because I needed to know if what I was sensing was real. He paused before responding, his gaze shifting away. The words that followed were soft, more reflective than defensive. He said things were complicated, that he hadn't meant to create distance, but that something inside him felt unresolved. I listened, even as something inside me started to hollow out. He wasn't cruel, wasn't careless. If anything, he was too careful, measuring his thoughts like every syllable might shatter something between us. He admitted he didn't want to pull me into his confusion, that he didn't have answers yet. It wasn't rejection, not fully. It was something murkier, a confession with no conclusion. And maybe that hurt more. I offered understanding, even though the ache was growing. I tried to smile, tried to reassure him that I didn't want pressure or demands. But in that moment, something inside me wilted. The days after became increasingly quiet. Our communication slowed. The warmth faded into habit. The looks we used to exchange became rarer, and when they did happen, they were too brief, too careful. It wasn't the silence that hurt, it was the fading. But I still remembered it all. The night air between us in the park. The softness of his voice when he'd leaned in. The weight of his hand in mine. These memories returned like echoes, gentle but persistent. Then, on a cool Thursday evening, another message appeared. It was short, just a request to talk. We met at the same park, near the pond where so much had begun. The air this time felt different, colder, somehow heavier. He was already there, standing alone by the bench, his shoulders slightly hunched. No greetings, no small talk, just the weight of the moment pressing down. He began to speak. Not directly, not dramatically. He said had been thinking, said that something about the way things were unfolding didn't feel sustainable. That uncertainty had started to take up too much space. He didn't use grand words, but the message was clear. He wasn't ready. He cared. That much he admitted, but what we'd started had grown beyond what he knew how to hold. He didn't want to keep going without clarity. He didn't want to promise something he wasn't sure he could offer. I stood there, the familiar ache rising. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I simply nodded. I told him I understood, even if understanding left a hollow in my chest. He looked relieved and heartbroken at the same time. Said I deserved more than what he could give. Said he didn't want me waiting for something that might never come. I didn't disagree. I didn't argue. I just stood in the cold, watching as the thing we'd built, careful, messy, beautiful, began to quietly dissolve between us. We exchanged a few last glances. Soft, tired, still filled with something unspoken. Then he turned and walked away. And I let him. Letting go wasn't a decision made in one moment. It was a process, slow, uneven, layered with denial and memory. The days after our last meeting stretched into a quiet unfamiliarity. He was no longer there, but everything still reminded me of him. The gym felt colder. Every corner whispered traces of where Head stood, where Head laughed, where Head looked at me like I was something more than just familiar. I went through the motions, workouts, errands, evenings spent pretending everything was normal, but nothing felt rooted. It was like I was floating through a version of my life that had lost its weight. I tried to stay busy, drowned myself in tasks, revisited old hobbies, filled every silent hour with something noisy. But even in distraction, his absence echoed. Not loudly, just persistently, like the hush of wind under a door you can't close completely. Sometimes I found myself checking my phone without realizing it, expecting his name to light up the screen again. It didn't. And with time, I stopped looking. What surprised me most wasn't how much I missed him. That had been inevitable. It was how much I missed the potential of him. The version of us that had existed in the space between what was and what could have been. That space had been beautiful, fragile, unreal, but real enough to feel. Eventually, the ache began to dull. It didn't disappear, but it softened, turned into something more manageable, like a scar instead of an open wound. I began to breathe easier, smile without forcing it, move through days without scanning the crowd for a face I knew wouldn't appear. And still, sometimes, I'd catch myself replaying the moments, not to relive them, but to remember that they had happened. The night in the sauna, the walk under the stars, the way his hand had fit around mine, steady and unsure at the same time. These weren't regrets. They were proof that something meaningful had once lived between us, even if only briefly. Weeks later, on a gray Sunday afternoon, I passed by the same cafe where we'd once sat in silence, words caught behind our teeth. The inside looked exactly the same. Warm lighting, soft shadows, people leaning across tables, caught in conversations they didn't know would become memories. I didn't go in. I kept walking. But that moment stayed with me the rest of the day, not as pain, but as a quiet recognition. I didn't hear from him again, at least not in the way I had hoped. One day, months later, his name appeared in a comment on someone else's post. A random online trace of someone who had once occupied so much space in my life. His face in the profile photo looked the same. Still him. Still familiar. But distant now, like a photograph fading in color over time. I didn't click. I didn't reach out. There was nothing left to say. But I smiled. Because I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I'd found something important in the space he'd left behind. Not closure. I didn't believe in clean endings. But peace. The kind that comes when you stop expecting people to become the version of themselves you imagined. What we shared didn't need a label to matter. It didn't need longevity to be real. It had shaped me, softened me, showed me the kind of connection I hadn't believed I was capable of. And even if it ended with uncertainty, it had begun with something true. In the months that followed, I met new people, laughed louder, stayed out later. Sometimes I caught glimpses of something familiar in someone else's expression, a tilt of the head, a certain kind of smile, but it wasn't him. And that was okay, because I wasn't looking to replace him. I was learning to live without holding on. Eventually, someone came along who didn't carry the same hesitation. Someone who asked questions without fear of the answers, who didn't pull away when things got real. And though I moved forward cautiously, I moved forward, step by step. But every so often, usually late at night when the city was quiet and my thoughts drifted too far, I'd remember the way Nolan had looked at me in that park, unsure, but full of something fragile and human. And I'd feel grateful, not because it had ended the way I wanted, but because it had happened at all.